Welcome to the Wall Street Lab podcast, where we interview top financial professionals and deconstruct their practices to give you an insider look into the world of finance.
Hello and welcome to episode number 31 of the Wall Street Lab podcast.
And this week we have something new because we are talking for the first time on this podcast to a world champion, and we will be talking about financial modeling. So this episode will be very interesting for those of you who are just getting into the fields of investment banking, hedge funds, private equity, anywhere else where financial modeling is heavily used. We'll get a lot into the technicalities of building such models and what to watch out for, as well as some pro tips from professionals. So Leo, why don't you tell us who have you been talking to this week and what have you discussed?
Absolutely, Luke. Thank you for that introduction. So we spoke to Joseph Lau this week, who is currently ranked world number one in financial modeling. And he won the ModelOff competition twice and was a finalist once. And for those of you who don't know what the ModelOff competition is, it's basically a global financial modeling competition. It starts online and then culminates in the finals in major cities such as New York City and London. And Joseph is currently a director of project financial modeling at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and he's been doing that for 12 years. And prior to that, he founded his own company called Spreadsheet Advantage. And just to put the cherry on top, he is also a PhD in pure mathematics from the University of Sydney. So he is the real deal, and he really knows what he's talking about, and a true gentleman and kind with his time. So I really enjoyed speaking to Joe, and I hope you enjoy this interview as well.
Really exciting. And before we jump into the interview, if you feel like this podcast has helped you in any way, we would really appreciate it if you could go to Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a 5-star rating, as it helps us enormously in reaching new audiences. And now, without further ado, let's jump into the interview.
Hello, Joseph. Thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us here at the Wall Street Lab. It's a true pleasure to have you on. I've always wanted to have you at the podcast because I myself have struggled throughout my career with financial modeling. So this gave me a great excuse to contact you. So thank you for being here.
Hello, Leo. Thank you very much for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, just so that people know, where are you based right now?
I'm based in Sydney, in Australia, working for Commonwealth Bank of Australia in the project finance area.
How did you become so good at financial modeling?
I did a degree in pure math, a PhD in pure math, and I thought I was just going to become an academic. When I graduated, I was looking around and there happened to be a job in model auditing. Now, for those people who don't know, model auditing is quite a standard in the Australian market for project finance deals. The idea is that we have a big project and there are many stakeholders, could be government, could be equity, banks, and everyone wants to make sure the financial model is correct. So instead of every single party go away and do their own checks, that's outsourced to an independent consultant. Could be one of the big four accounting firms. Mm-hmm. And I happen to be in one small financial consulting firm called Mercer Finance and Consulting. And what we do is go through an Excel model and go through it cell by cell to understand the logic and make comments and ask for corrections. And in the end, we sign off saying that the model is materially correct. So as you can imagine, that's a very good training ground for anyone starting out in financial modeling, because we get to see a lot of models and form our own views on what works and what mistakes people make. So that's where I started, and I spent 5 years doing model auditing.
Okay, so from what I hear, you have to be a PhD in mathematics and audit other people's work to become so good at what you do. Do you think you need a quantitative background to be good at it, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. I think anyone who is logical and has to be numerate, of course, can learn this. There's no specialist knowledge. I don't think a lot of universities will teach a whole course on project finance. So we really just learned on the job, and the qualification is more being logical and being able to think through what a model is representing in the real world and find logical inconsistencies and questions to ask. It's really just being curious, I think.
Okay. I read in an article that you were the oldest financial modeling world champion. So how did you get involved with ModelOff?
Well, ModelOff is a modeling competition that started by a few guys in Australia initially. So I've heard about it for a while, but never thought I would get involved. And then I think in 2014, there was this one night when I had nothing else to do. So I started to look up the past questions and thought, I can do some of these questions. Mm-hmm. So let's give it a go. So I started there and got into the final in 2014. Didn't win anything. Mm-hmm. But then in 2015 and 2016, I was fortunate enough to come first in that competition.
Mm-hmm. So for those who are not familiar with ModelOff, so is it a 2-phase process or how many steps do you have to get to the final?
They typically have 2 online rounds. So for those, everyone in the world will sign up and they will have to do it at exactly the same time. And based on the results of the first 2 rounds, I think 16 finalists get invited to the finals, and the finals is usually in New York or London, and they go to that city and basically for a whole day sit through grueling questions to live final. Mm-hmm. And based on the result of the finals, they decide who wins this year.
Mm-hmm. If we step back a little bit, what are the typical questions like for the first 2 rounds? Are they simple data cleaning or is it true financial modeling already? How are those questions like?
They always try to mix it up and make it interesting. So there will usually be some traditional financial modeling questions. So calculating debt, calculating interest, calculating or modeling a company's financial statements. Mm-hmm. That sort of traditional financial modeling. But then they will also have other questions to do with games or just cleaning data, as you say. Yeah, they do a really good job designing different questions to make it very interesting.
Mm-hmm. And then once you pass the first 2 rounds, you're invited. They fly you over to either New York or London, which is great, I imagine. And then you meet with your other 19 peers who, as I understand, are probably a few years younger than you. So how did it feel for the first time to be in the finals?
Oh, that was very exciting. I don't know. I think I just took it as it came. But I do feel that second time around, I was less nervous. First time when I went there, I didn't feel nervous. Mm-hmm. But I think just knowing the format, knowing how everything works, I think it really helped the second, third time.
And do they tell you in advance what they will ask, or are you just have to improvise as you go?
They will tell you roughly what the format is, as in how many questions, when you will have the breaks and so on. But as the actual content, no, not really. Mm-hmm. So it's really, when you get to there, you really have to react very quickly because some questions they only give you 30 minutes. And if you start off on the wrong track or find it hard to decide what to do, then you just basically can't finish it.
Mm-hmm. Are you able to look around and see who else is, how the other competitors are doing? Or usually there's no time for that?
There isn't much time. And to be honest, financial modeling isn't much of a spectator sport. So you can't really see what the other people are doing.
It depends who you ask, I think. I mean, I'm sure there are geeks out there who like watching other people work on Excel. But
well, I mean, there wasn't anyone who was, throwing their head in their hands and crying or anything like that. It's really hard to tell. The only time I think we do feel how other people are doing was once when Dermot Early, who won the year before me, he just finished the question so quickly and then he just walked off. And that, I think, must have psyched a few people out.
So, yeah, he was playing the psychological game, I guess.
Well, he got the question, so he can do what he wants.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned some questions they give you 30 minutes. How many questions are there in the final? And is it a whole day that you sit down and work on different models, or how does that work?
I think all up, it's probably 4 to 5 hours of extra test time with breaks in between. Some questions will be really, really long and you'll take an hour and a half or 2 hours. Some questions could be a lot shorter, and they change the format slightly every year.
Wow.
So it depends.
Yeah. And do you do any sort of preparation to get yourself mentally ready for those questions? Do you go running in the morning, or do you do anything in particular?
Not really. I think I'm fortunate that I work in a role where I do financial modeling every working day. Mm-hmm. And I've talked to other finalists. They actually work in a completely different area. Mm-hmm. They don't actually do financial modeling in their day job. And they do have to prepare a lot more just to remind themselves what the Excel functions are and so on. And to me, that's what's so amazing about some of these finalists. They're just so smart that they don't have as much experience as I do. Mm-hmm. And they can just turn up to a final and just perform at a very, very high level. Mm-hmm. Whereas for me, because I do this day to day, I don't actually do much preparation. All I do will be the week or two before, just go through some of the past questions. Mm-hmm. Not so much because I know that they won't give us the same type of questions, but it's more just to be mentally how to handle that time pressure and just give myself some reassurance that I can do this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So did I read it correctly, or I think you're the person who won it the most, right? Or has anyone else won it more than you have?
For now, I'm the only person who have won it twice. That's right.
And you're in the finals 4 times.
Yes.
Okay. And what was it about? Let's skip the very first one because it was your first experience, and as you mentioned, you're a bit nervous. But what was it about the final that you didn't win that you think made you not win?
I think most of the finalists will know that a lot of time it depends on the type of questions, mm-hmm. and different people have different strengths. Mm-hmm. Some people will be much better at the game type questions where you have to really sort of find a good algorithm to do something, to solve a game problem. My strength is probably more in the traditional financial modeling / project finance type questions. So really it's dependent on what type of questions you get. And I think the way the final usually pans out is the person who wins will do really well in one particular question, mm-hmm. and do well enough in the other questions to stay level with the other competitors, and then just excel in that one question. Mm-hmm. I think that's what happened to me as well.
Okay. So I know that financial modeling world champion is not as popular as some other types of world champions, but did your career change in any way, or did people treat you any differently? What was the type of repercussion that you had after winning it?
Well, I think it's a nice title to have. What I say to people is that it's a kind of validation of the type of skills I have. Every office, as you know, will have someone who is the Excel guru in the office. Mm-hmm. But until they have this world competition for modeling, it's very hard to tell whether I'm just a very big fish in a small pond or whether I'm actually very good. So it's good to have that kind of validation and just open doors to various groups, whether it's modeling meetups or a bit of public speaking in conferences. Mm-hmm. I don't work in a role where the modeling is a main service that we sell. It's more an internal function. So my role hasn't changed that much, mm-hmm. but it does mean that people know that I know what I'm talking about. And there's a bit of credibility there, so that's great.
But did that have some unintended consequences that your friends and people that maybe don't work at your firm started sending you Excel spreadsheets for you to fix? Or?
There is a bit of that, and a bit of people asking for career advice, which is fine. There are some occasions where people ask me to help them with their Excel questions that they get in interviews, and I said, I don't think I can help you with that. So that's a bit odd. That's a bit awkward.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is quite interesting. Thank you for that overview on the ModelOff competition in general. I guess, as you just alluded to, a lot of people who are listening to this are thinking, I would never be able to do what he did. He's a math PhD. He does it. He does financial modeling every single day at his day job. What would you tell them? I mean, is that a right way to start? Would you start it by getting good at Excel first and then get the basics of finance? Or would you start with an online course or a live course? What would you tell them?
Well, I don't think a maths degree is necessary. I tell my kids, I don't really use any maths beyond high school mathematics in project finance. I know if you work in some other areas, maybe in the quant field, then you do need some sort of PhD. But no, the type of maths that I deal with is very simple. It's more having that understanding of how numbers should behave. If you write a formula a certain way, what behavior do you expect? So trying to be good at maths is useful, but I think sort of high level, university level mathematics is not necessary. How to get good at modeling? I think just try to have that role where you do get exposure to a lot of models and where modeling is the main thing. I find that a lot of people want to learn modeling and they tell me they want to learn modeling, but they are in roles where modeling is just one of 20 things that they do. And I think it's quite hard then for them to actually become very good at it. Try to have a group of people that can give feedback to your work. That's the only way to learn. A lot of people go through courses, and I think at the end of it, if they don't use it or don't get feedback to correct what they're doing, they don't get to a point where writing good model or following good model practices becomes a second nature.
Mm-hmm. But where can you find, if not through courses, or if you don't work, if let's say you're an university student, how do you find proper financial modeling etiquette? Yeah.
There's some courses will go through that. What's good modeling practice? Mm-hmm. And if you join one of the big consulting firms that do financial modeling, like the Big Four accounting firms, for example, then they will have their own standards, and that's a very good way to learn about things.
Okay. And you mentioned the fact that having modeling as the main or one of the main inputs for your daily job is important. And you work in project finance. I'm assuming that there are some other areas in finance that you think modeling is just as important. I'm curious to hear your opinion there.
I think project finance, just by its nature, will require a more complex financial model because we're trying to understand the cash flow of a project in detail because we are only lending against the project. But certainly other areas of finance, like corporate finance, they still require good models. So there is finance also need good models. So yes, there are other areas that touch on similar things. There are some people who don't do this type of modeling, but then they're smart enough, they still get enough of Excel to become really good at it. Another source of good exercises is to go to the ModelOff website. You can get a lot of the past questions and just try them out yourself. And it's really great. One thing I learned through this experience is I look at other people's solutions and I just realized there are just so many different ways of solving the same problem. Excel is so versatile that there's just different ways of doing it. There's no one best way usually.
Yeah. Okay. So how do you, obviously in every model you have the risk of the model not being correct. So how do you, in your daily job, how do you prevent or how do you mitigate model risk?
I just become very pedantic in what I do. So, I just keep forming expectations of what numbers I should see, what the total should be, and keep reconciling it back to my expectation. And by pedantic, I mean if things are out by $1 out of 1 million, I'll try to look for why it's out by $1. And usually that means I'll find things that I haven't included or that I've done wrong. And just having that expectation rather than saying, well, close enough is good enough. I think that comes later when you have got a working model and you can start being a bit looser. But when you're building the model itself, I think going that extra mile to find what is different from what you expect, quite important.
Do you think that Microsoft Excel is always going to be the tool of choice for modeling, or do you think that might change in the future?
It's very hard for me to comment on. I work in project finance, and for that, I just can't see Excel going away because by its nature, project finance, every deal is different. Every structure is slightly different, and Excel is just so great for that. And also the transparency of Excel. As I mentioned in the beginning, everyone wants to look at this financial model and they want to change things in this financial model and they want to know how the results are arrived at. They don't want a black box. So for all these factors, Excel is just the tool of choice, and I just can't see it going away. I'm told that in other areas of the financial modeling world, there are other software out there now for doing budgeting and other things. So if you go to some other talk, they would say those tools will be the future, but I just don't know enough about those areas to comment.
Okay. So I'd like to get a bit specific here, and I read that you also train other professionals at your company on financial modeling. How do you go about teaching it? What is it that you focus on?
I mainly train the people who come through my team and need to learn about project finance modeling. Well, we really just spent a few hours going through the basics of some Excel functions that we'll use, the type of debt structure that you'll see and how to model those, project finance ratios, or the tips and pitfalls of those ratio calculations. And after that, he's really learning on the job. And I find the best thing to do is to let them do something and then comment on it, saying, well, here are the errors and here how I would approach it. And over time, they accumulate that experience, that knowledge, and that seems to be the way to train them up. Going through the course, yes, there are external courses out there too, and they're quite good, but unless you have this constant feedback and being held to a high standard, you don't become a good modeler.
Okay. Do you have any particular mistake that people make in modeling that you particularly don't like, or when you see it in a model, you get a lot of discomfort from it?
There are so many bad models out there. It's hard to say. Every model has a different way of making mistakes. I think what I find irritating is that a lot of models, I find they are very repetitive. The same thing is repeated a number of times and in different guises as well. So you move from something which is quarterly becomes an annual, and then the annual is converted back into quarterly. And sometimes it's in rows, sometimes it's in columns. And so I find a lot of models, they seem hugely complicated and the formulas are quite complicated, but they actually don't do a lot. And a lot of the work is just in converting and doing lookups to make sure that I reference the right cell. And to me, that's like a design problem of the models rather than really complex modeling. If the model is designed well so that the time periods are all aligned, or I stick to doing quarterly or stick to doing annual, then a lot of this complexity just goes away. So what I find is that because of this poor design at start, a lot of work is going into this referencing and converting rather than actually trying to model the business or trying to model the debt structure. And that I find a bit irritating. Sometimes I also have to admire the work that goes into doing all these references and actually not making a mistake. And to me, that's a case of people knowing enough to be dangerous. I think they know enough about the formulas and lookups and index match and all sorts of wonderful Excel functions. to do this sort of complicated referencing, and that means they feel they can get away with that instead of designing the model properly.
So they're adding complexity for complexity's sake, but not because the model requires it necessarily.
Yeah, it's not because the business logic or the deal structure requires it.
Okay, very interesting. Just one question back to the ModelOff competition. Are you still competing, or are you done?
No, I'm done. I have been retired, if that's the right word. Last year, in 2018, they introduced this Hall of Fame concept. A lot of the past finalists have been moving to this Hall of Fame, which means that we are not eligible to compete anymore.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. And I fully understand what they're trying to do. The organizers, they decided that the aim of the competition, they really want to move it towards uncovering new talent and making it educational. So they don't necessarily want the same people to turn up year after year and compete in the finals. So I fully understand that. And actually to make it more educational and fun for most of the competitors, you will notice that last year, round one is actually quite a lot simpler than previous years.
Oh, really?
And it's only round two that gets quite difficult. And they needed to be difficult in order to find the 16 finalists. So I'm still helping out a little bit. I'm not in the question design team, but I have been helping them with checking the questions before it goes live on the online rounds. So I'm staying involved in that sense.
Mm-hmm. So you wish you would still compete, but you just can't, or did I understand it?
Well, I think I was in two minds about it. I don't think I have anything left to prove, really, but I don't mind the free tickets and also being able to go there. And it's just meeting up with the other finalists, and they're just such a great bunch of guys.
Do you still keep in touch with some of those guys?
Yeah, with some of them, yes, I do.
Interesting.
Like Alvin Woon, who won in 2017. Yeah, I still catch up with him if I go back to Hong Kong.
And just curious, also, why do they call you fine wine? I couldn't find it anywhere.
I think that was a reference to my age.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, very subtle. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. I'm not sure how fond I remember that.
Well, Joseph, thank you very much. I mean, this is the first time we interviewed a world champion here at the Wall Street Lab, and I think if we were to interview someone, I think financial modeling is probably the only and the best place for us. So we're thrilled to have you on, and thank you for taking the time. I'll just go ahead and send you a few Excel spreadsheets that I have here at work. Maybe you can help me out.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's a great chat.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Wall Street Lab podcast. For the show notes and much more, visit us at www.thewallstreetlab.com. To see what we're up to before anyone else, subscribe to our newsletter on our website and follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
Disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast constitutes the opinions of individuals and should not be treated as investment, tax, financial, or legal advice. We take no responsibility for the accuracy of any statements made in this podcast. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only, and it does not contain an offer to sell or buy any sort of financial products, and should not be treated as advertisement for such. Any copying, distribution, or reproduction of this podcast without the prior permission of the creators of the podcast is strictly prohibited.